on the air, I was just doing one of my hobbies, which is making houses of cards. So I just have 2 more cards to put on, and if you just bear with me, I'll be able to do that. Otherwise I won't get a sense of completion for this whole thing. You think I could do it? I'm getting pretty good at this. Ta-da! Huh? It's a lot easier once you tape them together. Anyway, I like to start off that way to let you know that this is going to be hopefully a fun interaction with you all. And as Jenny said, I'm here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we do here and then talk about this idea of depression and dictators. First of all, I'd like you to know that we are at the nation's very first presidential library and the only one that was ever used by a president while they were actually president. And FDR got the idea for the presidential library from none other than President Washington. And Washington, of course, was our nation's first president. There had never been a president of the United States before. And so he wasn't so sure how he was going to do the job, so he just kind of made it up as he went along. And luckily, he had some great leadership skills. He'd been head of the Continental Congress and the Continental Army, big shot landowner back in Virginia, so he knew how to get stuff done. But he was a little bit concerned about the folks who followed him in office. Would they have those same set of skills, and would they be able to do the job as well? So one of the things he decided to do was to make his papers available to future presidents. So when he left office, he packed up all of his charts and graphs and memos and letters and reports and maps and all those things, took them back to Mount Vernon with the hopes of organizing them so they could be used by future presidents. That way, 3 or 4 presidents down the line, if there was a question about something that was going on, why are we having this problem with Spain or that problem with France, you could go back through the record, take a look at the documents, and get a sense of what had been said, what had been written, what had been agreed to, and what had been done. Well, that's great in theory. But unfortunately, President Washington died before he had a chance to organize his papers. And with him died the concept of the presidential library until President Roosevelt. In fact, many of George Washington's papers were actually destroyed. Yeah, they were eaten by rats. And the reason was because the words were on very, very tasty parchment paper, and the rats just couldn't help themselves. So they came in and they ate away at these documents. Get out of here, you. So we've lost a lot of our presidential history from Washington up to Roosevelt. Sometimes it was placed in wet, damp basements, not good conditions for documents. Sometimes it was placed in hot, dry attics, also not good conditions for documents. Sometimes if a presidential document had a signature on it, the signature might be cut off, sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. So President Roosevelt wanted to prevent that from happening. Now, the Library of Congress had begun to collect up bits and pieces of papers and presidential collections over the years, and they had, a little collection there. And when FDR was president, when he was getting ready to leave office, he said, "Well, do you guys want my presidential, papers?" And when they asked him how many he had, they said, "Well, you know what? We don't have enough space for all that." And so they said, "Well, how about we just take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this?" And he said, No. If you take anything, you take everything. I want my collection kept together." Well, the Library of Congress didn't have enough space for that. So Roosevelt decided to build his own presidential library, and he built it right here in Hyde Park. Now, just to give you an idea of the kinds of papers and amounts of stuff we're talking about, I want to show you this. You probably have maybe seen pictures of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., that big, long, tall, white building. Well, if you took all of our papers that we have here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and we have about 17.5 million pages of documents, and you stack them all on top of each other, it would be a stack not as tall as one Washington Monument, not as tall as 2 Washington monuments, but it would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stacked them all on top of each other. And the president had about 23,000 books in his personal book collection at the time of his death. We've since added to that. We've got about 50,000 books in our collection now, and about 35,000 museum objects. And when FDR decided to build this presidential library, he took a piece of paper, just a yellow legal pad, and he sketched out what he wanted his presidential library to look like on that paper. And this is what he drew. So it was on April 12th, 1937. Here's his initials. And he sketched out what he thought it should look like. And he wanted to have a large sloping roof, a nice inviting porch, big windows, and these little scratch marks here are Dutchess County fieldstone. That's what he wanted it covered in. Not brick or wood, but he wanted it covered in the stones that were literally found in the fields. So from this rough sketch, the architect went ahead and created this building right here. And if you notice, it's got many of the same architectural features. It's got the large sloping roof. It's got the big windows built around a nice courtyard here with a nice porch. And it's got that Dutchess County fieldstone siding that President Roosevelt wanted to have on there. So every president since Roosevelt has built a presidential library. And I want to show you, this is what the presidential library system looks like today. Let's zoom in on that. Mr. President, I have to just move you out of the way a little bit. And so this is the presidential library system as it exists today. And I'm speaking to you up here from the Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City. And then the rest of them are sprinkled around out here. Now, does anybody know where President Obama is going to put his presidential library? Any ideas? No? Well, he's going to put it in Chicago, which is over here in Illinois. But for a while there, he was thinking about putting it in Hawaii. And I was so excited about that I went out and bought all kinds of Hawaiian shirts, and I was all ready to put in for my transfer papers, and then he picked Chicago. Not that there's anything wrong with Chicago, but if you got a choice between spending your career in Hawaii and Chicago, well, anyway, it just goes to show sometimes early planning can backfire on you. So this is the presidential library system as it exists today, and what I'm here to talk to you about is President and Mrs. Roosevelt. And these were two really important people of the 20th century. And our title is this idea of depression and dictators, because President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt were in the White House during two really important times in American history. In the 20th century, there were two big giant crises, or two big giant problems that the country was facing. Does anybody know what they were? What were the big problems? Yeah, somebody answer.
Great Depression and World War II?
Exactly, the Great Depression and World War II. Now, either one of those problems would have been a big enough problem to deal with by itself. But President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt dealt with both of those problems back to back. So when President Roosevelt became president, we were in a Great Depression. And let me ask you this. How many of you folks out there get an allowance from your mom or your dad? How many folks? Right? A good number, right? And what do you do with that allowance?
Save it. Spend it.
Spend it, right? Buy stuff and spend it. Now, when you buy that stuff and you spend stuff, you spend money on stuff, it kind of makes you happy, right? So what would happen? What would happen if your mom or your dad came to you and said, "Listen, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to give you an allowance anymore"? How would that make you feel? Sad, right? Right? If mom and dad suddenly came and said, "Look, I can't give you any money anymore for your allowance," it's going to make you sad. It might even make you depressed. And that's the idea behind the Great Depression. Only instead of young people like yourselves getting an allowance, it was grown-ups who were losing their paychecks because their jobs were going away. Farmers weren't able to grow things on their farms, and so they weren't able to get any money to buy the things that they needed. And they couldn't pay back the bank who they had bought the farms from, and so many of them lost their farms. And factory workers lost their jobs, and so they weren't able to buy things. And it had a big spiraling effect. And it made a lot of people really sad all around the country. And in fact, during that time, they went around and they took pictures of the way people were living in those times. And I want to share some of those pictures with you. So this is a picture of a family during the Great Depression. And we'll zero in on a little bit. Okay. So look what this family is living with here, okay? So here's a mom, and she's got a little baby, and look how tired this dad looks, and how scratched and dirty his hands are. And look what they're living in. They're living in a tent. So they've lost their home, and these are migrant workers. So what they're doing is they're traveling around the country looking for jobs, looking for places to work. And this man is very tired. Now imagine how tired you would be if you worked all day, doing things with your hands, picking fruit, or working on roadways and things, and you had to go home at night and sleep in a tent. And then the next day you get up and you start it all over again. So this was very common for people to have to move around and to travel around. Sometimes when people were looking for jobs, they would hop on railroad cars, and they would just hop on the railroad cars, and they would go to the next town, and they would jump off and try to find work there as well. So here's a family that's what they call riding the rails. So here's a mom and a dad and two little kids, and they're just sitting next to this train car waiting to get on there and move along to the next place. Here's another picture from the Great Depression. And this family is at least lucky enough to have a car they can travel around in. But again, look at the kinds of conditions that the kids' clothes are in, and how tired and stressed out the parents look. Okay, this is why they call it the Great Depression, because the economy was depressed. It wasn't creating jobs, it wasn't creating money, and people had very, very hard times living in those days. Here's another example. And this is a guy, and he's lucky enough at least to have a shack. But look what the house that he's living in, the shack is made out of. It's made out of old pieces of wood and cardboard and those types of things. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Great Depression. It was a very sad time in America when people lost their jobs, didn't have enough money to buy the things that they wanted. And just like you guys might not be able to buy, candy or ice cream or go to the movies if you lost your allowance, people in the Great Depression couldn't buy food to feed their families, and they couldn't, put together enough money to make it on their own. So that was the Great Depression. Now, at the same time that this was going on, there was a guy in Europe. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he was beginning to take over Europe. And you guys probably talk about bullies in school. You talk about bullies in school, and how bad. All right, and how bad bullies are? Well, Adolf Hitler was like the biggest bully ever. And if he didn't like you, and he didn't like who you were, or what religion you were, or what color you were, or where you came from, he would give you a really hard time. And in a lot of cases, many, many, many millions of cases, he would actually take people and put them into little camps that were very, very, very terrible places to live. And he even went and took over countries, and he even went and killed people that he didn't think, were good enough to be around. And that's nobody's job. Nobody has the right to do that. So he was a huge bully, and FDR stood up to him in Europe. But before we had a chance to get over there in Europe, there was and where the war was already started, there was a problem that went on here with the United States, and that was a thing called Pearl Harbor. Did anybody ever hear of Pearl Harbor? Okay, great. What happened to Pearl Harbor? Any ideas?
It was bombed by Japan. It got bombed by Japan.
Right. It was bombed by Japan. Why did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor?
Jordan.
They
bombed Pearl Harbor because they knew that America wasn't going there because they were at a different battle. They were starting somewhere else.
Okay, right. Let me show you a map. Right. This is a map of the Pacific area. Okay. Oh, let me get this out of the way. I'll show you what. Put it up here. And here is the United States, and here is Japan. And Japan was also starting to act kind of bully-like. And they started to take over parts of other countries because they were looking for resources. And what the United States did was we put this big base out here at Pearl Harbor, And this was kind of like giving them a warning. It's almost like when you put a big old dog out at the end of your driveway to scare away crooks and burglars. Well, that's kind of what this was. And what we were trying to do was to intimidate the Japanese into not being so aggressive around the Pacific Rim. But it backfired, because what the Japanese said was, well, if they're going to put that big dog out there, that big military base, we have to do one of two things. Either we have to listen to what the United States is saying and not take over these countries out here, or we can knock that base out and then we can do whatever we want to do over here. And that's what they did. Now, I want to share something with you, and I'm going to ask you what you think this is. What do you think this is? What does this look like? Any ideas? A what?
What they used in the war in Japan?
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, you guys are good. Sometimes I show this to students and they say, oh, is it a salad bowl? And it's not a salad bowl. Or sometimes, is it a lampshade? It's not a lampshade. What this is a Japanese army helmet from World War II. And you'll notice that it's made out of bamboo. And it was held on the soldier's head with burlap straps that would be tied underneath his chin. And this is what they were going into battle with. And look, it's held together with vines, okay, with just regular old vines that were tied together. Now, this is not going to give you a lot of protection if you go into a battle. So what the Japanese were looking for was steel and oil. They wanted to make their stuff out of metal, their helmets out of metal, but they had run out of metal. So they were taking over other countries, and they were taking over those other countries to get access to the steel that they had in those countries and also the oil that they had in those countries. So that's what the Japanese were looking for. They were looking for resources in those other countries, and the only country that could have stopped them was the United States. So what Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were doing during that time that they were in office is, first, they were dealing with the Great Depression and trying to get people jobs and trying to get people back into into places where they could work. And then after that, they got into the World War II began, and they got into trying to help the countries in World War II. And so their presidency was marked by these two terrible things: this depression on the one hand, and having to deal with all of these dictators on the other hand, and stand up to them. Now, one of the things that was really important about President Roosevelt was, do you know how many times he was elected to the presidency? How many times was he elected president?
Say it loud.
Twice.
Well,
He said twice.
not just twice, but then he was elected to a third term, and then he was elected to a fourth term. Back in those days, they didn't have any rules about how many times you could be elected president, so he was elected to the presidency 4 times, and he served 3 full terms, and then he died just 83 days into his 4th term. And so what happened was, he was president for 12 years, longer than anybody ever has been or ever will be, because now we have a 22nd Amendment which prevents that from happening. So you can imagine the president being president for a really long time. As a matter of fact, probably some of you folks are maybe only about 12 years old, right? So imagine the president being president for as long as you guys have been alive. It's a long time to be president, and there's a lot of problems that you have to deal with while you're in office for that long. Now, there was another really important thing about President Roosevelt, very special thing about him while he was president. And what do you know about President Roosevelt's health?
Listen.
He had polio.
Yes, he had polio, and he wasn't able to walk. And so I want to show you, this is a model of President Roosevelt's wheelchair. And if you notice, this wheelchair is a little bit different than the wheelchairs you see today. It's got the big wheels in the front and the little wheels in the back. And you'll notice that it's nothing more than a kitchen chair, right, that's been, the legs have been cut off of, and it's been attached to a metal frame. And FDR designed this chair himself so that he could get into this very easily and go from place to place. And there are no arms on this chair, and that was so that when he got where he wanted to be, he could just slide off into a more comfortable chair. So he designed this chair himself. You'll notice it's very narrow, right? It's not a very wide chair, no wider really than a kitchen chair. Also on the side of his chair, he's got the ever-present ashtray, right? Because FDR was a big-time smoker. He was a big-time smoker, and today he's dead, boys and girls. Okay? So, right. So think about that. Now, what's important about this is that FDR needed this wheelchair to get from one spot to the other because he had polio. But he didn't just take polio lying down. He didn't let it stop him from doing what it was that he wanted to do or what he had to do. And in fact, he created a place in Warm Springs, Georgia, that was there to help fight polio. And in order to fund that place in Warm Springs, Georgia, he asked the people across the United States to send dimes to him, to send in their dimes. So the next time you guys get some pocket change, take a look at a dime. Who's on the dime?
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right. If you take a look at who's on the dime, it's none other than Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now I'm going to use a very important piece of technology. You guys ever see those 3D movies? You ever been? And you got to wear glasses for those, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, we have some technology here where you don't have to wear the glasses. We can just make it be three-dimensional. Look at that. Doesn't it look like it's coming right at you? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, huh? Okay, so the next time you get some pocket change, you're going to notice that Franklin Roosevelt is on there. He's on the dime, and he's on the dime because of an organization that he created called the March of Dimes. And he asked people all across the country to send money. Yeah, huh? See?
They're doing that because every year they raise money and walk for March of Dimes.
No way. You do? Did you know that? That's awesome. Did you know that Franklin Roosevelt started the March of Dimes?
No. I just want to go on record as saying I taught them that in 3rd grade, a lot of them.
But they forgot.
Right.
I was here in your 3rd grade.
Well, that's good that we're getting a review now. He created the March of Dimes. He asked people to send in dimes because it was very expensive to get leg braces and doctors and medicine for people who had polio. Then, in 1955, President Roosevelt had already been dead by then, but in 1955, they used some of that funding from the March of Dimes, and they created a polio vaccine that little babies get when they're little. And so then they don't get polio anymore. Once they pretty much eliminated polio, they said, well, we've got a great organization here. What else can we do? And they said, how about we help to fight birth defects in little babies? And so the March of Dimes then left the polio stuff, and they started helping little babies, preemies, and to help to fight birth defects. So if you guys are doing that stuff, you're marching for the March of Dimes, you have a direct connection to Franklin Roosevelt, and I bet you he would be very, very happy to know that you guys down there are doing this all these years later to help people out just the way he wanted to help people out as well. So that's awesome. I think that's great that you guys are doing that. And just sometimes people will ask, well, who was on the dime before FDR? And it was a woman by the name of Lady Liberty. So this is what the dime looks like today, and that's what it looked like back in those days. Okay? Great. Now, have anybody there like science? You guys like science?
Yes.
All right. Well, you may not have seen this yet, but there's a thing in science called the periodic table of the elements. Have you ever seen that? You ever heard about that? Well, it's this chart that shows all the things that things can be made out of. It's called the periodic table of the elements. And we've created something like that to help kids understand about Franklin Roosevelt. And we have here, instead of a periodic table of the elements, we have a periodic table of the New Deal. And so when FDR, excuse me, Mrs. Roosevelt, when FDR was president, this is a chart that shows the programs that he created. So he created over 44 programs called the New Deal. And these programs were designed to help fight that Great Depression that we talked about a minute ago. And these programs were designed to get people jobs. And the idea of this was so that you would have a job and you'd have someplace to go every day, and you would have money that you could go out and buy the things that you wanted to buy, and that would stimulate the economy. Because if you suddenly had money to go to the movies, then the guy that runs the movie theater would start up the movies, and he would make some money, and everybody would make money all the way across the way. So sometimes the New Deal was called the alphabet soup programs, because they were known by their initials. Like this is the AAA, and there was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, Agricultural Adjustment Act, Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. These were programs that created jobs all across the country and got the country moving again. And it was by creating these programs that they built hospitals and schools and libraries and roads and bridges and water lines and electricity lines. And they did a lot. Half the infrastructure in the United States was built during the Great Depression. So this is one of the reasons why we think of FDR as being a great president, because not only was he elected to 4 terms, not only did he do everything that he did from a wheelchair, but he also created all these programs that helped to get us through the Great Depression. But wait, there's more. He also got us through the Second World War. So we created a periodic table of World War II. And this shows a lot of the countries and the battles and some of the folks that were involved in the Second World War. And the Second World War, boys and girls, was a big, 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 big war. 60 million people died all across the country, all across the world, in countries all across the world during World War II. World War I, which was about 100 years ago, about 11 million people died during that war, and they called that the war to end all wars. And then there was World War II, where 60 million people were killed. Okay, so this is some of the stuff that we have that shows you a little bit about World War II. So Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the things that was really important about them is they never gave up. All right, they always felt like there was something that they could do. So even though they were in this Great Depression, even though they were facing down these big, mean dictators all around the world, they always believed in the goodness of people, and they always believed that if people worked hard and worked together, we could get the job done. And he created those programs to bring people together so they could work together. And he brought together the alliance that helped defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. And they were always looking ahead. And one of the things that's interesting, remember I said we have 17.5 million pages of documents in our collection? When you look at the documents in our collection, you can't go more than, maybe 20 or 30 pages without seeing words like our children or our children's children or future generations. And when you see President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt talking about those children or their children's children or those future generations, you know who they're talking about? They're talking about us. And so they were always looking ahead to the future. They were always looking forward to how they wanted the world to be and how they wanted the world to be set up. And one of the things that FDR did was he talked about 4 freedoms that he wanted to have in the world. And the first of these 4 freedoms was a thing called freedom of speech. And this is a portrait that shows a guy standing up at a town hall meeting saying what it is that he wants to say. So one of the important values that we have in the United States is that we have the freedom to say what we want to say. We have the freedom to say what's on our mind and to talk about it. We don't always agree with each other, but we do have the ability to share our ideas. And then this is the second freedom, freedom of worship. So this allows people to pray and to worship however they want. So you can't have somebody say, well, the way I believe in God is better than the way you believe in God. This allows everybody to believe in God the same way. I'm sorry, not the same way, whatever way they want. And then this is freedom from want. And this was during the Great Depression and during the war. A lot of people didn't have food. And so this is a nice Thanksgiving dinner. And this is the idea that you have a right to have a good meal, to have a warm meal every day, and a safe place to live and a safe place to have that meal. So that's the third freedom, freedom from want. And the fourth freedom of FDR's freedoms are the freedom from fear. And this is a mom and a dad, and they're tucking in their kids to bed at night. And if we really focus in, let's see if we can do it here. On that newspaper, I don't know if you guys can read that, but it says bombings and horror. And so what this shows is that the dad is reading about bad things that are going on in the world, but his children are being tucked safely into bed at night, all nice and cozy, and they're going to bed safe and sound. So those are what's called the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And those were four important ideas that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt believed in, and they used those ideas to help motivate themselves and other people to try to get through the Great Depression and the Second World War. So I hope that shows you a little bit about what FDR was facing in his time, the Depression and the war, and doing it all from a wheelchair. And what a happy coincidence that we happen to make that connection, that you guys are supporting the March of Dimes just the way FDR did back in his time. Are there any questions or comments that you guys wanted to add, or teachers, did you want to jump in with any questions or comments? Something I missed that you
Well, I'm
you may
going to
want
let
to
them
address?
ask you their questions. Jordan, talk loud.
Were these freedom acts, were they a part of the 22nd Amendment?
I'm sorry.
Were these freedom acts? Were the freedom acts part of the 22nd Amendment?
No, the 22nd Amendment actually came way later. The 22nd Amendment came in 1953 after President Roosevelt had already died. But these four freedoms, he first spoke about them in 1941, just before we got into World War II. And he said, if we're going to stand up to these bullies, we have to know what we're standing up for. And we're standing up for our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, our freedom from want, and our freedom from fear. And that's what we're fighting these guys about. That's what they're trying to spread around the world, and that's what we're going to prevent from happening.
All right,
Sure.
Darby?
This is a comment. Don't we have an old CCC road?
Yes, in Adairsville, where we live, 5 miles from here, we actually have a CCC road, and my parents live on it, so we've talked about that.
That's great.
I know.
And you know what
Daniel?
the CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that took young men to out to the woods to make roads and to build bridges and to clear land and to plant forests and those kinds of things. So it gave those young men jobs that they wouldn't have had if they didn't have the CCC. So that's great that your teacher's mom and dad live on a CCC road.
All right, Daniel, talk loud, baby.
I was thinking Babe Ruth is kind of like President Roosevelt in a way.
How is Babe Ruth like President Roosevelt?
Well, first of all, they both have and they have bad habits like smoking and stuff. And
Right.
But they can also be very friendly.
Well, we always like it when we make a connection to some of our previous learning. Emma, you have.
Did FDR design the car that he controlled with his hands to get around?
Well, he did sort of do that. Yes, he wanted a car that he could drive around by himself, because the thing about being president is it's a really tough job, and when you're president, everybody wants something from you. So, like when you guys are doing your homework, maybe you get up and you go for a little walk, or you get a drink of water or something like that. President Roosevelt couldn't do that because he couldn't walk. So when he had his car, he said, I'd like to be able to get out there and drive around. So they specially modified his car so that he could drive it and work the brake and the accelerator with levers that were put in there for him. And that gave him a sense of freedom and mobility. So he could go and they would lift him into his car, he'd start it up, and he could drive around and get a sense of being out there and about and moving around, which he didn't have because of the polio. So yeah, that was a very special car that was designed for him. And he didn't design the hand levers himself, but he said that he would like to have a car that was like that. And then from that idea, they put the mechanisms together.
Merrick.
What were the wheelchairs he designed? What was it made out of?
Well, the wheelchair he designed was made out of nothing more than, let me focus in on this. It was a wooden kitchen chair and then a metal frame with the wheels attached to the metal frame. So wheelchairs back in those days were usually big, giant chairs that were made out of like a substance called wicker, which is like baskets are made out of like wicker sometimes. So those wheelchairs were really big and they were really cumbersome and they were hard to get out of. So FDR liked to be able to get in and out of his wheelchair very comfortably and very quickly. So it's nothing more than a wooden chair that has been built onto a metal frame and the wheels attached that way.
All right. Thank you so much. We have got to, Hayden, we've got time for one more quick question, and then we'll have to take these guys to lunch. Hayden?
Okay.
How did he move his wheelchair?
How did he move his wheelchair?
Well, he moved his wheelchair by spinning these large wheels. So when you move these wheels, the wheelchair would move. So if you turn this one front ways and that one back ways, that way it would turn. And if you push them both front ways, then that would move you forward, just like you see people working with wheelchairs, today. But again, this was really important to him because it gave him a sense of freedom and mobility that he, you guys know how it is. Like, you ever been home sick for like a week with the flu or something like that, and you just get there and you're all achy and you're tired and you just want to get up and go out and play? Well, that's how President Roosevelt felt, except he didn't have the flu. He had polio. So he wanted to be able to get up and do the things that he liked to do, and this wheelchair helped him to be able to do that. Now, listen,
right.
I don't want to get in the way of you guys having lunch, but I do want to say you guys had some great questions. It's been a great opportunity for me to come in and talk with you, and I've really appreciated doing that. So let's do it again sometime, maybe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Well, we do have some schools that are joining the live stream, and if they have any questions at all, then they can go ahead and send those in via Twitter with the hashtag PPSP2017, which stands for the Presidential Primary Sources Project 2017. So let's see if there are any schools that are watching the live stream that might have questions for Jeff.
Okay. Any questions? Don't be shy. This is your big opportunity to find out everything you want to know about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, but we're afraid to ask.
That's right. We'll just check and see if there's anything here.
It takes a minute or two to tweet in.
Yes.
While you guys do that, I'm going to play with Falla. This was FDR's dog, Falla. He was a Scotch Terrier. You probably can't see him in front of my shirt here. But he loved his little dog, Falla, because Falla would give him a lot of fun and pleasure by just, playing ball with him or running around with him. And Falla didn't want anything but a little bone. He just wanted a little food bone on President Roosevelt's tray every morning for breakfast. They would put a little doggy bone on there, and then Falla would get to share in the breakfast by having the doggy bone. And so that's why Falla was so popular with FDR, because he wasn't bothering him about things any time. He just wanted his bone.
Now, Jeff, is Falla buried close to President Roosevelt?
Falla is buried very close to President Roosevelt. In fact, he's buried just behind President Roosevelt's tombstone. So they're maybe, I would say, like less than 10 feet apart.
Okay, so they're enjoying each other now as well.
Even now as we speak. Yeah. Yeah,
That's
Falla
great.
lived for a couple of years after FDR died. It was very, very sad. But then he went to live with Mrs. Roosevelt, who was very good to him. And he loved Mrs. Roosevelt, but he didn't love Mrs. Roosevelt as well as he loved President Roosevelt. But, he was kind of like a one-person dog. But they're all together now.
What's your
Well,
favorite artifact at the museum?
oh my goodness, my favorite artifact at the museum. I think it would have to either be his car, because I know how much that meant to him to be able to drive that car around, or it might be his desk. Because the interesting thing about his desk is that it was actually the desk that was used by Herbert Hoover for the 4 years that Herbert Hoover was president before Roosevelt. So when President Roosevelt got to the White House, he didn't, rearrange all the furniture and everything. He just said, hey, you know what? We're going to use the furniture that we have here. So that desk was used first for 4 years by President Hoover, then for 12 years by President Roosevelt, and then for a few months by President Truman. So that desk has had a lot of history. You think about all the 44 programs of the New Deal, the development of the atomic bomb, the creation of the United Nations, the strategies to win World War II. All of that stuff worked on right there at that desk when President Roosevelt was president, plus all the big decisions that President Hoover had to make and the big decisions that President Truman had to make right away. So that piece of furniture has got a lot of history attached to it. So that probably is my favorite piece.
I can see why that would be your favorite.
Yeah.
Definitely when it sees all that history.
Yeah.
So, well, it doesn't look like there are any questions from the live stream audience.
Okay.
So thank you very much for sharing all of this wonderful information about President Roosevelt with us today. And
It's been
we
my
look
pleasure.
forward to joining you in the future.
Great. And if you want to know more stuff about President Roosevelt, please visit our website, www.fdrlibrary, all one word, .marist, marist.org. And you can go on there and get all kinds of access. We have about 1 million pages on our website if you want to take a look at some of the documents that we have in our collection.